Welcome back. Yes, the route is back, and some may even call episode 89 the comeback route. As always, the route is now presented by White Whale Marketing. The route is a glorified sports business coffee chat that has a new guest every episode as they share their route and experiences in sports. I'm Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. Before we begin, obviously this is the first episode back in I think about 6 months or so. There'll be an update, just as always. The update episodes are every 20, so you can look out for episode 100, and you can maybe hear a little more of the behind the scenes and how everything works. But yeah, glad to be back. We have a bunch of episodes being recorded, getting lined up, so we're gonna have endless amount of podcasts for you again, and glad to be back as well. Before we get into today's guest, just a couple things to go over as always. First, and most importantly, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast. So, as you can see below me here, if you're watching on video, we're on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and many others. So, subscribe to us, follow us, whatever that platform needs you to do, and rate 5 stars, leave a nice comment, different things like that allows us to grow just from the engagement. So, please take the time to do that, and that's much appreciated. Secondly, if you haven't already, you can see here on YouTube, top right corner, left corner, however you're viewing this, at The Route Sports. So you can follow us on social media. If you're listening to this podcast, the best platform for you is probably LinkedIn, a great way for you to open your network, meet with new people, maybe even connect and say, hey, I heard you on this podcast. I'd love to maybe, grab a call, something like that. Great way, but we're also on all other platforms. Also give White Whale Marketing a follow. That's White Whale mktg. And before we get into today's guest, let me tell you about BetStamp. If you're someone who likes to place a couple bucks on your favorite team, listen up. Don't be a fool like me, where I was using only one sportsbook while I was betting all season. And, I'd place a bet, then I'd watch TSN at intermission, and their sponsor would have better odds than what I placed. The solution? Use BetStamp to compare the best available odds amongst all sports books. The only way you're going to get an edge in online sports betting is by having an account with multiple sports books. So download the BetStamp app or go to betstamp.app/Ontario and use the code WHALE so you can get access to their affiliates and their prices. So with BetStamp, it allows you to verify the existence of a proposed bet with the corresponding odds. This provides you to buy and sell picks with full transparency. Users selling sports picks on BetStamp do not sacrifice any royalty or cut to the app. It's completely free. So again, if you want an edge in sports betting, use BetStamp by downloading their app or visiting betstamp.app/Ontario using the code WHALE to get access to their affiliates and their pricing. Check it out. So I'd now like to welcome someone who I was fortunate enough to meet when I had my 32 school esports tournament. I got even more lucky when they were helping us out with the White Whale Marketing team. They've had experiences when they're in university from all over. The London Knights, all over Brampton, Toronto, anyways. And he was also the co-chair of the Ivy Sports Leadership Conference. He's a great contributor to the Sport Marketeer newsletter that we have, and he's now rising through the ranks with the Vancouver Canucks in the NHL. Currently, as a corporate partnerships coordinator, Brampton's very own Hiral Patel. Welcome to the route. How's it going?
Chris, you're too kind. It's great to be here. I'm excited the route is back up, and I'm honored to be part of the comeback route episode. I listened to the route for a bunch of episodes kind of before even our paths crossed. And ever since our paths crossed, I've still been listening to it. So it feels like one of the best cliches in movies when you get to be on something that you've been listening to kind of throughout the years. So definitely excited to be here.
Yeah, I know that's awesome here, and I'm glad you're the episode 89, the comeback route episode, because I think who better to kind of have than Hiral, and kind of excited to get into it. And even though you're a special guest in my eyes, I still think we got to start it like every other episode. Take us through your route. So if you're new here, what that means is, where did Hiral kind of start with sports business? Was it through a passion growing up? Was it, hey, I was going to attend this program at university, got experience, I'm like, hey, this is something I wanted to get into? And take us how that began to where you got to where you are today, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, gladly. So The route definitely started on the mean streets of Brampton, Ontario. Everyone knows it when they hear me explain that it's heaven on earth. This is the city I was born and raised in for the first 22 years of my life. But unconventional to how many careers in sports might start, mine didn't start on the field. I didn't really grow up playing any sort of recreational or organized sports, unless you count that one summer in grade 3 where my mom signed me up for soccer. Great time. But I never, early on at least, I didn't really have the same dreams or sights of being a professional athlete. But everything I was doing was surrounded by sports, watching sports, talking sports, even walking sports. Wasn't much of a runner myself. But I knew for sure if I wanted to be in sports, it was definitely going to be not in the dressing room, but in the boardroom. And kind of early on, I figured that if I wanted to, it was definitely a distant dream always, but it would have to be done on the sports business side. So let's flash forward over to the end of high school. I'm choosing my university choices, and lucky enough, I had a couple of offers to work with. So definitely fortunate there to have the opportunity to choose where I wanted to go. And before I continue on, kind of like a good disclaimer here, as all financial and legal experts kind of say that what they say is never legal advice or sound financial advice. What I'm about to say right now isn't sound educational advice in any sort of way. But the way I chose my university was I kind of went through all my acceptances, the cities they were located in, and then I searched up their OHL teams and potential internships. So I looked at, the London Knights. I looked at other OHL teams, and the London Knights were one of the only teams at that point that had a dedicated page on their website that showed and demonstrated a program that allows university students to intern with them during the season. And I figured that was perfect for me because I was going to be, if I chose Western at that time, in London for the months of October to April, which is just in line with the hockey season. And it goes without saying that the London Knights are one of the premier OHL organizations. And if you're looking to propel your career or get an opportunity to work with one of the best pro sports teams, I guess, at the OHL level, London Knights are definitely one that comes to mind for a lot of people. And so with that, I took a leap of faith and decided to accept my offer to Western University. My academic career kind of had a couple ups, couple downs, definitely more downs than ups, but I kind of flip-flopped between economics and history, just trying to find the best mashup of subjects that I enjoyed studying that I felt might be able to help me in a potential career. And I'll be honest, the career path that I thought I had set up for myself or that I thought I might end up seeing myself into changed probably week by week after first and second year. You hear people have a conversation, you read an article, and everything changed. But at the crux of it, what I enjoyed doing the most and what I spent my time doing the most was always related to the sports and entertainment industry. Whether it was, the articles I read, the conversations I had, the media I consumed, it was all surrounded by sports. So I figured, if we're going to not have maybe the greatest educational foundation here, got to kind of, for lack of a better term, go all in on the sports side, or at least try to see how far I can take the dream. And so in my second year, I applied with the London Knights, was grateful enough to be a game day intern with them for all the years that I was at Western and that the OHL had a season. So about 3.5 seasons I was there, kind of there on game days, learning about the ins and outs of what it takes to build up a pro franchise and kind of not really build up the team itself, but what it's like to put on a show. And for anyone who is in the city of London, Ontario, and knows what sports is all about, the Knights are at the center of it. It's one of the only barns in the OHL that sells out night after night. Got a very passionate and a very loyal fan base with a deep history of not only NHL players, but just a history in that city itself. So it's a great opportunity for me to learn a bunch about, what it's like to work for a professional team. And outside of that, in my extracurricular activities, I participated in my school sports business club. One of the things that was started during my undergrad was the Ivy Sports Leadership Conference. So I was grateful enough to participate in that in my first year as a case competition competitor, I guess. And with my team, we were grateful enough to win in the first year of it. Next year, I decided to apply out as an exec, and I was lucky enough to co-chair it in the first COVID year and the first virtual year that conferences kind of started taking on that platform. So those who know me know that I've been surrounded by sports and sports business my entire life since, I guess, university started. It was one of the things that I would talk passionately about. It was one of the things that I would put more effort into compared to some of the other priorities and commitments that I might have had during my undergraduate years, and propelled that to just put my best foot forward, take leaps of faith wherever I can, and it gave me some great opportunities. Got to meet you, Chris, got to work with White Whale Marketing as I kind of finished my undergrad. And then ultimately, I was lucky enough to be selected as one of the top prospects, which is one of the interns with the Vancouver Canucks. Spent a season there, just finished it up, and now I've just started my new role, as you mentioned, the corporate partnerships coordinator. So definitely a lot more route running to do, but I'd say it's pretty good for a first and 10.
Yeah, no, that's so like we've had a bunch of conversations, even just like there's so many questions I already have. Like even just going like to the very beginning of how you kind of, picked your university. I didn't know that. And that's kind of like I said, that's like the beauty of the route, right? Where everyone's a little different how they kind of come about it, where, I was saying this in another recording that's gonna be coming out where, the whole purpose of this is just to kind of take different nuggets from everyone rather than trying to run the same route. So let's just kind of go back to where you're starting, and then we'll kind of work through it. What you kind of said here that really kind of stood out to me was at the end of high school when you're picking university, how you picked your university based off internships. That like shocked me because like knowing myself, I was, ever since I was in elementary school, always, into sports, playing sports, had an interest in kind of being in it. But I never really knew that was a career, right? Beyond like playing on the field of play. So I was just going to go accounting. And then I never really kind of wavered from that. And I was like, oh, whatever, I'll like do this, do that, get into an accounting firm X, Y, Z. But I never really kind of looked at it where kind of similar to that book, I think it's called Working Backwards. It's about like how Amazon works. And that's essentially what you did, right? You're like, hey, I want to get a career in sports. I'm going to go to the school that kind of gives me the best opportunity to do so because that's what's in that area. And I like that a lot. So like how did you think of that coming out of high school? Because that's impressive.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think a big reason of kind of why and how I was able to make that choice was we're lucky enough in Ontario to have a lot of different universities to choose from. The programs that I ultimately selected, the ones that I was accepted from and which ones kind of rejected me, kind of helped make the choice a bit easier, where I had a couple of programs kind of left at me that weren't necessarily, I would say, they're never going to be the top 10 or top 20 of programs that you search up or anything like that. So I didn't get into any of the big name schools or the big name programs, and had a couple of, nice offers from local universities that I could choose from. So Western was definitely one of them. And I figured that all of them were kind of at an undergraduate sort of business / economics type of program. So the program was definitely all the same everywhere. Luckily enough, tuition was also pretty similar all over. And ultimately, I know Western, it's a great university that had a lot of connections. It's a really big institution with a lot of history. And part of me thought, if maybe I ever got my grades up and I would end up going to like the Ivy School of Business or end up going to law school or something like that, it'd be great to do it at a school where I maybe already get exposed to it, like have some opportunities to know what it's like to be in a law school because lawyers are all around you. Same goes with business school. So those kinds of elements helped me choose Western. But that was kind of like the final nail there was, and the kicker was definitely the London Knights one, kind of just going with the dollar in a dream for lack of a better term, but thinking, hey, the London Knights are there. It was at the time that, Mitch Marner had just got drafted, and you see the plethora of talent that gets drafted to the NHL from like Bo Horvat, who's a Canuck shout out, but Matthew Tkachuk, Max Domi, Mitch Marner, the list goes on and on. And I figured if the London Knights are one of the best at producing NHL talent, maybe they're pretty good at producing, NHL talent off the ice. And with, some of the members that have gone on to be executives in the NHL, I thought it's definitely a good organization. And if it's something that I could potentially get my foot into, it's worth the risk.
Yeah.
Obviously, when it came to convincing my parents, it was more on the academic conversation and taking the risk academically. But 4 years later, we saw that one risk actually paid off and the other one wasn't necessarily the best risk, but it's worked out pretty well overall.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And like the other thing that you're kind of saying about when you're in school, right? From what you're saying now, it kind of seems like you always had somewhat of a path that, hey, this was how I was going to like go about it for maybe career-wise, like for sports. But you kind of mentioned how, week by week in the first and second year, you're kind of always kind of going in between which career you wanted to go. Did you ever really waver from sports, or is it more so what in sports?
Sports was always it was always the dream, right? It was the dream that very few are lucky enough to actually pursue. I didn't necessarily have any idea of what working in sports business was like until I reached university. And at the end of the day, it was always still a distant dream. There's only X amount of franchises that exist, especially in Canada, only X amount of positions available. So I wasn't sure about how vast the field was. So in every kind of step I took, especially my first couple of years, the focus was obviously to get a good paying job, all of the cliches that come into play when you're a first year student kind of studying business or social science. But sports was always kind of in the back of the mind where it's like, it'd be great if it would work out. But I kind of try to almost play two paths where it's like, you want to work hard to make sure you put yourself into a successful position somewhere where there's probably a lot more positions and opportunities available. And then sports is always one where imagine if it works out, it would be great. So, I looked at things like finance, accounting, marketing, what have you. My favorite story, I guess I could tell from first year is I went to, I think, my first ever speaker series, which was for careers in finance. And so, it seemed like a pretty good field for me to go into. I like computers. I use Excel. I can definitely work my way around financial statements if I study it for 4 years or something. So it seemed like a very comfortable desk job. But I think one of the first things that someone told me was like, you're gonna, if you don't like coffee, you might as well get used to it. And I was not a big coffee drinker then, not a big coffee drinker now, but the vibes of that first session, whether it was from my end or from the speaker's end, didn't necessarily attract me to the world of finance or banking. And so, we moved on to the next one, moved on to like, what's marketing look like? What does operations look like? What does sales look like? And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that there's going to be something available for everyone. It's ultimately on us to kind of seek out what perfection might look like or what the ideal path might look like. And I think a lot of the, I guess, kind of motivators that I had, or the reassurances, I should say, that I had throughout my undergraduate education kind of helped me continue on the path of sports. Being part of the sports business club, working with the London Knights, those reassurances were like, hey, maybe I can actually do something like this. And then ultimately I decided to keep rolling with that and keep on trying to find new opportunities and see if there's a fit for me somewhere. And I kept building, I guess, confidence from there. And ultimately, once I hit kind of third and fourth year, it was kind of the fork in the road. And I ultimately chose the right lane, no pun intended, but that was the sports route.
Yeah. That's interesting to think of because, yeah, right. Like everyone's kind of has I remember when I first realized sports could be like a potential career. I remember I talked to a professor when I was in stage and he's like, no. He's like, just go do accounting. He's like, you're good at it. He's like, you have a good business mindset. He's like, you'll do fine with that. And he's like, leave sports for the weekends when you want to kind of get away from work and different things like that. But then kind of maybe similar where it'd be cool one day. So in my mind, even when I was looking at accounting, I'm like, okay, hopefully by the time I'm 40, I'll save up like enough money, have enough in the bank where I can then launch something similar to like Ballers, right? Like an accounting firm or a financial firm or a financial advisement firm for athletes. And then, boom, I hated, not that, yeah, it's fine, but it wasn't for me for 40, 50 years. And that's why I kind of fell down the path for marketing. And then, one thing led to another. So that's pretty interesting to kind of look at it from that. During that time, I know you're saying you're kind of experiencing different things. You're saying, hey, what's this? What's that? I think that's a great conversation to have because very rarely does someone ever kind of be like, hey, this is what I'm going to do from like the age of 5. And that's what you end up doing. Right. So, was there ever like, I don't know, like for instance, me, I was working a government job in accounting where I kind of went so far away one lane and then kind of switched back over, or you were always kind of doing step and never had that big transfer?
For me, I don't say I ever kind of had that big step where I went too far one way. For me, I worked at a warehouse for the first couple of summers of university. It was a steady paying job. I had dedicated hours there. And it was just a good opportunity for me to be able to still take summer school on the side because you have, the 9 to 5, but you still have the rest of the hours or a couple of hours here and there to still kind of work on yourself. And ultimately, the reason kind of why I got those jobs was because I didn't end up getting those big name internships or anything like that in my first or second year. But it's funny really because as I was kind of working in the warehouse, one was kind of not too far from home, but still like my mom kind of drove me to work and it would be like half an hour before I started because she has to go to her own job. And so I had maybe half an hour to kill and I spent it on Indeed, kind of just applying to jobs here and there. And luckily enough, the Canada Summer Jobs Program, which was started, I guess, maybe 5+ years ago, which is like summer internships that are funded by the government to companies and non-for-profit organizations. I found a couple of marketing/media internships through there. And so for the first 2 summers, it kind of started off as we'll work in the warehouse until we find something else. And surely enough, one time in June, something came up. So for the rest of the 2 months, I did a small little marketing internship. And then second and third year, found an internship with Brampton Focus Community Media, went back to them for the last couple of summers as well. But it was kind of always much more of a, you have something, just kind of work towards it. And then, try to use the resources you have around you to still try to make something work. I know the big names are always going to be there. You want that Wasserman, the MLSE internship. You want these big names to be on your resume right from first year. And I was no different. I was definitely in a similar boat to a lot of people where obviously there might be 20 positions available for like 200 to 300 people who are applying, and I was never selected for any of those. But, we kind of just thought that there's experience to be found everywhere. And as a university student, you're always balancing the experience versus the money aspect of things. And I tried to do a good balance of both, which is ultimately where I kind of ended up where I am. But I would say for the most part, I was always kind of, go with the flow. If an opportunity comes, we take it. But in the meantime, if something's available in front of you, just kind of walk through that door and then, keep knocking and see if another door opens up.
Yeah, no, that's for sure like an interesting debate to have, right? Where, yeah, there's experience versus money when you're in university, but then there's also like experience versus academia, I would say to a sense, right? Like, hey, are you going to be that student where, you're studying 24/7, you're getting A pluses, but then you lack necessarily experiences? Sure, you may finish at the top of your class, but your network might not be as large, or hey, like you might not have as much applicable work experience rather than like theoretical, right? So I
Right.
think that's kind of an interesting discussion to have as well, right? Where, you know, obviously, like I'll use my example. I had a dad that he went to the same university that I did, got a business degree there, and even though he was an accountant and all that good stuff, his whole thing that he kept saying to me was just get the degree. He's like, that's all anyone cares. He's like, get the degree, get the piece of paper, and he's like, get experience. He's like, all anyone cares is your experience. And then I've even had conversations with guests after they've been on this podcast, and I think one stated once, they're like, think about it. When has anyone, at least in Canada, I know some other countries they actually look at the grades and stuff, but in Canada, they're like, when was the last time someone actually asked to see your degree? I was like, no one's ever asked me to see my degree. I got it. It's in a nice frame in my bedroom. No one has ever asked to see it, right? And it's more so, hey, like, what have you done since then? That degree kind of says, okay, cool. She, then whatever. They went to university. They kind of checked that off. They got that prerequisite, but what can they do afterwards with that skill set or that those underlying traits that they develop? So I for sure see that. And obviously, from what you're saying, you kind of killed in the sense of you kind of grew with the Ivy. You kind of you won that case. Then you got involved with the sports conference, right? Is that how you're saying? And those are two
Yep.
separate things. And then you're using those kind of experiences in sports to kind of level up every time, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
essentially. And, that's kind of where sometimes decisions kind of get made for you. And if I could go back, obviously, I wish I spent more time kind of taking my academics a bit more seriously to open up more paths because, there's definitely pros and cons to both approaches. But kind of after I got into that third and fourth year, I ended up seeing that a lot of the successes that I had at the undergraduate level were in my extracurriculars. So more of my time was prioritized there. But that's kind of the whole beauty of university, right? Especially like, when you're lucky enough to be able to go to school, be able to, explore the extracurriculars with the academics, you kind of see what works and what doesn't for you. And ultimately for some, the academic side is a great way for them to open those doors up. For me, not so much. And I was lucky enough that I didn't have to rely on the academic side of it because if we had to, I honestly probably wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So
Yeah,
definitely,
but
there's a mix and match there.
I completely agree with that, right? Where I don't know, like, how do you say this correctly? Look, I think there's some master's programs for sports management students. Sure, that they make sense, but then like I interviewed someone once, or maybe I went for a coffee chat. I don't remember if they went on, but I think they were end up. I think they were like the club president of the sports business club. They were, one of the head of their class for their sports master's degree. And then here they are. Okay, they got all this, these degrees. They have these, degrees in sports. So, hey, I'm ready for the sports world, right? And they finally go to the sports world, and they're like, you know what? I did so much school. I have so much quote unquote experience, a lot of theory. I'm only going to apply for manager or director level positions because I got to pay off my debt. I got to, kind of jump in there because I think that's where I belong. And
Yeah.
then as they were doing the interviews, they're like, oh, you know what? No one, like, at least for them, they're like, no one necessarily cared about that, right? They're like, hey, like, what have you done in regards to experience? Like, if you're applying for this manager position, how do you manage people? What would you do in this situation? What would you do in that situation? And that's one of the things where they're learning, where they're like, hey, like, my degree wasn't able to teach me that, but if I had that experience of doing internships, so maybe there's a perfect balance of having both, where you've, club president, working internships, and also, getting those academia. But obviously, it's different for everyone. So I completely agree in that sense. And then I guess kind of the cool thing to kind of get into, right? Obviously, I've been following along with your journey the last little bit ever since the esports tournament, which I guess it's been 2 years now, if I'm not mistaken.
Time
Um,
flies.
Time has flown, and it's crazy just to think about that esports tournament. But how did the Canucks position come about, and maybe tell us a bit more about, hey, like what did that internship role look like?
Yeah, so the Canucks have had this top prospects program for a couple of years now. And I was lucky enough that one of my colleagues at the Knights who I worked with, he actually applied and he was a part of the program as well a couple of years before I did. So I chatted with him, asked him how his experience went, and I didn't end up applying the year that I spoke to him about it. Um, I applied the year after, but it turns out that based on the way the conditions of the world were, um, with the pandemic and stuff, that entire season was played out in a bubble, and I'm pretty sure they didn't have any top prospects interns. So I doubt the program would have run, but never put my hat in the ring or anything like that. And then taking that year off of school, or not off of school, taking that year out of school and doing school online, I gave it a better thought, and I thought, you know what, hey, let's give it a shot, let's apply. So put my application forward, went through the interview processes there, and ultimately ended up in a position with the sales and membership team on the sales side. So it was a great experience. I mean, first time kind of being, well, I guess for starters, it was my first time ever in Vancouver and on the West Coast. So moved out in August of 2021 to what some might say is the best coast. Left home, kind of got settled, and then we're in the internship. And the experience it was a roller coaster. And a lot of that has to do with the season that we had as well. For any Canadian NHL fans, you know that with the Omicron variant, there was that little pause in the middle. We were at 50%. The capacity of the fans was changed in between season, and then ultimately near the end of the season, doors were fully open to fans in Vancouver. But navigating through that was definitely one of the most valuable parts of the experience. Having those conversations with fans, talking to them about the conditions, the situation, and ultimately as an intern on the phone, you are the expert. For someone on the other side of the phone, they don't care if they're talking to a manager, an account executive, or an intern. If you're on the phone representing, Vancouver Canucks and Canucks Sports and Entertainment, the answers you have are the only answers that they get. And so ultimately, it was a really cool experience to be like, you are in the driver's seat. You got to make sure you're getting the right information out, and ultimately having good conversations with fans in between the games. And then ultimately, obviously, when you're selling tickets, you got to make sure you're quoting them the right price, crossing off your T's, dotting all your I's. But it really felt like you were in that season there as a full-time, member of the Canucks, simply because we were getting the business back up as an organization, and as an intern because of the sales, I guess, the sales role and talking to fans. You are out there representing the company. And so ultimately you feel like you had a real full-time job there and didn't really feel like a conventional internship.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I know, like, throughout the season we're chatting, you're like, especially during the variant, right, where all the games were postponed and they kind of came back, and then you're calling the fans and all that stuff. So that's very exciting. And then now, like, I know you're this current position very new, right? Within the last month, I don't know, do you have anything to touch on about that for maybe anyone listening, or maybe they're students, or like, hey, like, that's cool to see that you went through the program and now you're actually going to a full-time position. So maybe you can kind of touch on that before we kind of close things out a bit.
Yeah, so with the new position I'm in, it's funny because when you think about sports, obviously one of the most glamorous positions, and I guess the sexy term in sports management is always on the corporate partnerships team. For me, after finishing out the 8-month internship with the sales department, there were a couple of positions available across multiple departments in the organization, and I was lucky enough to receive the position on the corporate partnerships team. But for me, what I'm really excited to get into is I've had the opportunity now to understand one aspect and one big pillar of the revenue arm of the organization. Because with any league in sports, especially North American sports, it very much is gate driven. So having that whole season month opportunity to learn about what it's like to be on that side of the revenue generating side of it, and learning about the various ways ticket sales help drive the business. Kind of now moving forward to the other side, and another important pillar of the revenue side, which is the corporate partnerships team, is kind of what I'm really excited to dive into. Ultimately, I think one of the probably coolest pieces of insight I can say from the first couple of weeks that I've been in there is that obviously the assets you're selling are different, the numbers are different, the people you're talking to are different, but the role is the same. You might think of corporate partnerships as being a tier above regular ticket sales, but I don't really see it that way, because at the end of the day, your role is to find people to have conversations with them, get to know them better, have them get to know you, and ultimately you're making a business deal with them. For some people, you're just selling season tickets. It might just be a single ticket and you're bringing a group down for a birthday party or something like that. And on the corporate partnership side, obviously you've got the contracts to work with. There's a bit more of paperwork, long conversations, and more of a different type of relationship you're building. But on the final balance sheet, a dollar is a dollar. So whether it's on the corporate partnership side, whether it's on the retail side, whether it's on the ticket sales side, you're still driving revenue into the business and you're helping it grow, expand, and ultimately operate. So there's a lot of similarities that I've seen from both departments. And another thing I guess I would say is also you got to have a lot of synergy between all the departments for an organization to successfully run. So, there's a lot of work that goes with the ticket sales team, that works with the corporate partnerships team, that works with the marketing team, and overall the entire, almost every department on every floor. So it's really cool to be able to transition over to a new department, but still have a lot of work that's done kind of cross-departmentally.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, and I'm sure you're gonna kill it. And I'm excited to hear where things go next with that. I guess as we're kind of wrapping that up, I think that's kind of a perfect question to maybe ask before I kind of get into my last two questions I like to ask everyone. Where do you see Hiral going? What do you want to become, or is that something that you're just kind of like the rest of your career with academia? We'll see where it happens, and decisions might be made for you.
It's funny. I've always been a go with the flow kind of guy, and going with the flow has worked out for me. But I will preface that by saying it doesn't kind of come with just, waiting for something to come to you. It is, keeping your eyes open, your ears open, and just giving yourself that opportunity to be able to step into any path that comes next. So I don't know if academia is what's going to be next for me, if it's kind of, progressing where I am in my organization, kind of crossing jobs, changing positions, or anything like that. But ultimately where I am now is kind of the same attitude I've had, I would say, since university started. There's a lot of people with a lot more experience that I'm working with that I'm really hoping just to learn from, get their insights. And ultimately, whether it's a path I see myself following in, or if I need to carve out a brand new path for myself, we'll cross that bridge when it comes, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't come with the groundwork that comes before to set yourself up for that position. So, just started in the role, kind of going to play it out season by season at least, or at least give it a couple of years. But the goal is to build as many bridges and have as many doors open for me kind of when I want to make a potential change. And then we'll walk through the one that seems like the perfect fit.
Yeah, that's a great answer. All right. Well, I got two questions I like to ask everyone. I like to say, as I say every episode, and I say to everyone who probably knows me fairly well, I'm going to 103, knock on wood. That's what's going to happen. And I'm going to be on a rocking chair. So what I like to ask guests, if you were to go fast forward to the future, you're on your own rocking chair, you're 103 years old. To date, what is a story from your career that stands out? You're like, wow, I can't believe I got to do that for a living, or that was a cool time in sports.
That's an interesting story. There's definitely a couple of ones that I can think of here and there, but one that's a really fun one for me at least is it's going to lead back to Brampton. All roads lead through Brampton, especially when it comes to me. And so this story takes place in Brampton a couple of years ago. Our current mayor and the mayor at the time, Patrick Brown, held a hockey tournament, or a hockey game, sorry, that was for charity. And ultimately the goal was to raise funds for the local hospital. There's renovations and stuff that the hospital is hoping to do. So Patrick Brown is someone who has a lot of connections in the hockey world. So he brought in a lot of different players, kind of called up some friends, some favors, I guess, but there were some star-studded talent. Let's put it that way. And I was working with Brampton Focus Community Media at the time. The reason why I like to tell this story, I'll explain probably why later, but let's just kind of walk through the events. We show up there. I'm not sure exactly what my role was supposed to be. I like to be behind the scenes, so I thought I was going to be operating the camera, setting up equipment, typical stuff that I did throughout the internship. Ultimately, I was handed the mic and was told, all right, these players are coming and it's time to interview them. And so there wasn't a lot of different media outlets that were actually there. There was Sportsnet was there, but they didn't send out a full crew. Brampton Focus Community Media was there, and I was there, and there were a couple of other local outlets that were there. So it was a very small scrum. But Mike Keenan, Jason Spezza, and Doug Gilmore were three of the guys that came out independently and separately to kind of talk and be interviewed. And the Sportsnet guy who's setting up his camera, there is no person who's doing interviews on behalf of Sportsnet. They just sent the camera guy and the mic. And he asked me, do you have any questions prepped? And I was just like no. Just saw him holding the mic and thought I was asking the questions or whatever. But ultimately, my boss came and he's like, yep, you're asking the questions. And then the Sportsnet guy's like, I hope you got something ready because I got nothing planned. And it was a great spontaneous moment where, I got to talk to Jason Spezza. I got to talk to Doug Gilmore. I tried to keep it as hockey as possible, ask them questions about what it's like to be in Brampton. For Spezza, I think it was his first season that he signed with the Leafs, so he hadn't played a game yet in a Leafs uniform. So I asked him about that. And then later on, we ran into Nav Bhatia, who is the Raptors super fan. And so we did a quick interview with him as well. But I didn't expect to be interviewing anybody there. And then ultimately, I was given the mic and told, ask these guys questions because I was the guy who liked hockey and I was probably one of the only guys there at that moment that knew every one of those players and could maybe tell you a little bit about them. So it's kind of thrown into the fire in that sense. And I'd say I got off quite well. I don't know exactly where that footage is, but hopefully it's probably for the better that it's not out there all over the place. But ultimately, the reason why I probably want to tell that story is because that opportunity came out of absolutely nowhere. It had nothing to do with sports. I didn't go into that internship knowing that there was going to be a hockey game at the end of it for charity where I was going to see these players and potentially have that opportunity to talk to athletes. But it was just, I was in the right place at the right time, trying to pick up on a couple of skills that I thought would be good experience for me and kind of work in my community where I grew up and kind of love and still hold to this day. But I would love to tell that story. Hopefully there's better stories to tell, but that's the one that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I think it's a good way to describe the opportunities that kind of come to me at random moments and just kind of seizing them. So for anyone kind of who would be willing to listen to that story, probably would tell it a couple more times.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. I haven't heard that either, but just goes to show some things just happen, right? You're in the right place, right time, things line up, and then right, and now it's a memory you'll have forever. So that's awesome. And then now, the other question I'd like to ask: went to the future, now we'll go to the past. You're talking to Hiral, end of high school, about to enter university. Maybe you're starting university. What are you saying to him now that you've had these experiences? What's some advice? You're like, hey, I wish 18-year-old Hiral knew, or hey, I wish 18-year-old Chris knew this, or hey, I wish 18-year-old or 42 Jimbo listening to this knew this. What's something that you would provide?
18-year-old Hiral might not like this advice because he wasn't a Joel Embiid fan until maybe 2 years ago, but trust the process. That's probably the biggest thing I would say. For me, there wasn't a lot of certainty, and there still isn't any certainty with where things are going to be going. There's no job that was ready for me at the end of university, and I'd probably tell 18-year-old Hiral that as well. For a fact that nothing's going to be necessarily waiting for you after university. Well, congratulations, you're right about that. And so based on that, I think that I was definitely fortunate enough to be raised with, a good set of values, I would say, that kind of did me well when it came to, just respecting the people around me, kind of, being humble in the position that you are and just not saying no to any opportunities, obviously within reasonable circumstances. But, I was always there to give a helping hand, I'd say, and be there and be available. And I think kind of being there and doing things, even though it's not the most glamorous thing, especially at the London Knights, a lot of my day-to-day role was maybe setting up chairs, cleaning cars, literally wearing a suit and running around the arena, making sure things are set up and stuff. It's none of that's glamorous stuff, but whenever there was a question asked about who can do this, I never was shy to raise my hand and say, no worries, it'll get done and I'll make sure it gets done. So I thought that I set myself up for a good process in terms of how to be a good asset to any team. And evidently, it's worked out well where I've been able to explore different opportunities and be trusted as someone reliable that people can count on. And hopefully, people will be able to say good things about. And ultimately, that's all we can ask for. And so I tell 18-year-old all that, just, do what you can. The rest of the things that aren't in your hands shouldn't be things you should be stressing about. But just put yourself up, put your best foot forward, set yourself up for success, and then whatever happens, happens. But if one door closes, just take a left or take a right and find another one.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's a kind of a great way to end it, and that's why I like asking those questions at the very end. Yeah, Hiral, appreciate you being the first guest that I have back. I'm sure there's going to be many more, and hopefully maybe we'll do even some like reunion things, or who knows what ends up happening. We'll see. Like as you say, trust the process. And unless there's anything else you'd like to share, I really appreciate you coming on. It's always great connecting.
No, it's been a pleasure. I'm not someone who likes to really be open about a lot of things that I do. I like to stay behind the scenes. So definitely appreciate the opportunity to share some of the insights that I might have had. Hopefully, it wasn't something that was too long, or I know I tried to be slower, but sometimes I speak too fast. Hopefully, there's some good wisdom or some good nuggets of insight there for those who are listening. But everything that Chris echoed at the beginning, I'm sure he's going to echo at the end of the podcast. Make sure you're following, make sure you're checking them out, because you never know when an opportunity could pop up. You might see something interesting that could lead you one way or another way that leads you to somewhere you might never expect. So you're going to see a bunch of links everywhere. You're going to hear a bunch of links everywhere. So I'll leave it to you, Chris, to tell them where to go, but make sure you've got your eyes open.
Yeah, I know. Haral's just setting me up always, as just like the White Whale Marketing Pod we've had. But yeah, so just to conclude it, don't forget, subscribe to the podcast, follow, check us out on social media at The Route Sports, at White Whale MKTG. And then lastly, but not least, check the link in bio if you're watching on YouTube or you're listening. There will be a link for the BetStamp app or the web link where you can sign up using code White Whale. And stay tuned for next week. We'll be here for the foreseeable future. Thank you again, and see you next week.